All right, here we go. Last day of notes for radiometric dating. And the last thing you wrote down was this right here. It would take about 15.6 half-lives of carbon-14 to decay to the point where modern AMS machines cannot detect it anymore. Because again, these machines are extremely sensitive, they're extremely sophisticated, they're extremely expensive, but they're only so sensitive. You know, if you have carbon-14 and it's decaying over time and getting smaller and smaller and smaller compared with the rest of your sample, it's only a matter of time before those machines, as sophisticated and as sensitive as they are, that they just can't see it anymore. And that point would come after about 15 half-lives, about 90,000 years. Now, where this turns really important is, if we're talking about things that the scientific community is telling us are millions or billions of years old, well, if those things really are that old, they ought to have absolutely no trace of radioactive carbon-14 still left in them, because it should have decayed to the point where our machines just can't detect it anymore. So let's take a look at some of these examples and see what we actually find. So in 2003, some coal samples were collected by the U.S. Department of Energy from different strata in different states. The age range of these coal samples, according to the scientific community, ranged from 37 million to 318 million years old. But they decided to carbon date these coal samples, and they came back with 45,000 years to 60,000 years. And I don't want you to get lost in these numbers. You're going to want to write this down here. It's tough to imagine these periods of time just existing in the short period of time that we do. But the real thing here, folks, is we're finding radioactive carbon in samples where it should not be. If these coal samples really are 37 million to 318 million years old, there should be no radioactive carbon left in them unless they're really not that old. Coal is made up mostly of carbon, and when it's made, it has both radioactive carbon and non-radioactive carbon. So over this period of time, over even 100,000 years, it should have all decayed to the point where we can't find any more radioactive carbon. And yet there it is, right in front of us. And it's not just coal. You're going to want to write this down as well, this information about diamonds. So inside diamonds, you've got some radioactive carbon, and you've got some non-radioactive carbon. And, if diamonds have been around for 1 billion years to 3 billion years, like the scientific community tells us, then there ought to be no trace of any radioactive carbon left, because it should have all decayed to the point where our machines just can't find it. And yet, when we radiometrically date diamonds, we get examples of results like this, 50,000 years old. In other words, there's a significant amount of radioactive carbon still inside these diamonds where it shouldn't be if they're really that old. And it's not just coal, it's not just diamonds. Anytime you radiometrically date dinosaur fossils using carbon dating, you get the same type of result. So you're going to want to write this down here as well. Yeah, make sure you get all this written down here. Yeah, from here down. Stuff on top there. That was just for the only thing you should be missing in your notes should be the stuff on the bottom. So in addition to all of this, then, when we're dealing with carbon dating, I'm going to want you to write down all of the next slide here. So something is definitely wrong with the insanely long ages associated with radiometric dating. But why do we still get ages way older than 6,000 years for radiocarbon dating? Because the Bible seems to indicate that our world is about 6,000 years old or so. So what's going on with these numbers? How come we're getting numbers back so much larger than that? And that's something that we're going to talk about here shortly. Go ahead and write all this down, and then we'll get into that. Let's keep it down a little bit, folks. Thanks. People are trying to focus to write all this down here. So when we're looking at this information here, again, somehow we got to account for the fact that this method is giving us numbers that are much larger than the age of the earth based on the biblical account. Because again, the Bible is our starting point. We work from there. So when we look at these numbers and where that discrepancy could possibly exist, there's something that we have to make sure we acknowledge. Remember, the accuracy of radiocarbon dating is dependent on the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 being the same as it is now in the atmosphere before the flood. And it almost certainly was not. And we're going to talk about why that is and the effects of that coming up here. You're going to write this entire slide down as well. Sure it does. So when we deal with this, folks, again, we start with God's Word as truth. That is our foundation. But there's no reason to think that the information we look at in God's world should go against His Word. After all, He created this world through His Word. So whenever something in science seems to go against what the Bible is clearly telling us, chances are we just haven't investigated thoroughly enough. And that's kind of what's going on here. Whenever you have these supposed discrepancies, just a closer look at what's really going on usually reveals the answer. So the Earth has an enormous amount of coal. It's the most readily available energy source in the world. There's even more coal out there than oil. Now, coal is the result of buried vegetation. Whether you believe in the biblical version of history or the secular version of history, everybody acknowledges that coal is the result of buried vegetation. So the pre-flood world must have had an enormous amount of vegetation. Because if Noah's flood buried all of these plants, again, all those plants used to be active and growing on Earth's surface. Well, guess what? If you take all the coal in the world, and there's a lot of it, and if you could transform that back into vegetation, back into greenery on Earth's surface right here, right now, it would not survive. And the reason it would not survive is there's not enough carbon-12 in our atmosphere to support it. Plants prefer to take in carbon-12. They also take in carbon-14. But they prefer to take in this carbon-12. It's like their air. It's like their oxygen to us. But it would be like putting too many people in a room with too little air to breathe. You're not going to last very long. So the only way that this vegetation could have survived before the flood is if there was more carbon-12 in our atmosphere at that time. And if you have, by comparison, more carbon-12 in the atmosphere proportionally than carbon-14 back before the flood, that's going to throw your dates way off. And in addition to that, the intense volcanism associated with the flood would have dumped billions of tons of non-radioactive carbon, carbon-12, into the atmosphere, even further decreasing that ratio compared to today. So let's think about this. Let's think about this. And I'm going to turn the lights on so that the folks at home watching this in the future can see what's going on here. So we looked at these last time, right? So carbon-14 decays over time. It does not remain constant. It decays into nitrogen-14. Carbon-12 remains constant after something dies. So when we try and think about how long something has been deceased, what we do is we look at the proportion of these two things. So something that has been dead for a short period of time, would that have more carbon-14 or more carbon-12 by comparison? More carbon-14, absolutely, because that carbon-14 had not had all that much time to decay into nitrogen-14. So you'd have, by proportion, more carbon-14 in that ratio compared with carbon-12. So this would be something that was relatively young, something that had not passed away all that long ago. But if you're looking at something down here where the proportion between these two things is a lot more like this, where you've got a lot less carbon-14 and a lot more carbon-12, well, now that carbon-14 has had a longer period of time to decay and go away, so by proportion you've got more of this red carbon-12. So this would be something that's older, that's been dead a lot longer. So if we've got all this extra carbon-12 in our atmosphere before the flood, again, it had to be there to support all the plants that were on the surface back then, that's going to skew everything as being older than it really is when we radiocarbon date these things. For this reason, if you start with more carbon-12 in the atmosphere, it's going to skew all of your results to look older than they really are. And you're going to want to write down the very first sentence of this slide, which says basically that. Yeah, go ahead. Just the first sentence. No, that's a comma. Sentence ends right here, right at reality. Again, one of the slides you wrote down, I think last time, was that in order for carbon dating to be accurate, the amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere has to be constant all the way back in time. And in terms of the flood, it almost certainly was not. That's why these numbers are so far off. Guess what? There's only one more slide you need to write things down for here. Aside from the summary, write this whole thing down, including the title. So in order to talk about this, I want you to pretend that it's your birthday. Is it anybody's birthday today?
Yeah, it's mine.
Is it really?
No.
Okay. Imagine it's your birthday and you're at home and your dad gives you a balloon and he says, "Son or daughter, this balloon is very special to me because I got this balloon when I turned your age, maybe 20, 30 years ago or something." Would you believe him?
No.
Why not?
Because if the balloon looks fresh, you know I'm not going to believe it.
Exactly. So you know full well that if you buy a helium balloon that's made out of this rubbery material, even just 2 days ahead of time before a party, it's going to be on the floor and you're going to be disappointed. Helium leaks out of these balloons extremely fast. Helium is a very small molecule, so it doesn't have all that difficult of a time weaseling out between the rubber molecules there, and it escapes into space. So in the same way, there are these things called zircon crystals deep inside the Earth, and they have helium inside of them too. It's there on account of some radioactive processes that are going on, and these crystals are supposed to be 1.5 billion years old. And yet, when we look at these zircon crystals that have supposedly been in existence for 1.5 billion years, they still have all this helium left in them. Folks, if you wouldn't believe your own father when he gives you a helium balloon that he says is still fresh from when he had his birthday 20, 30 years ago or whenever that might have been, there's no reason we should believe the scientific community when they tell us these things are 1.5 billion years old. The helium should be long gone, and yet there it is, staring at us smack in the face. That helium should have long since leaked out of these samples to the point where it's undetectable. And yet there it is. So when we look at this stuff, a scientist by the name of Russell Humphreys did some research using helium diffusion, helium leaking out of these zircon crystals, and he used it to actually measure the age of the crystals themselves. And you can see some of the results from his experiment here. And he plotted his results on this graph. And as you can see, when you use the actual real data in real time along with the creation model, they line up extremely well. The uniformitarian or the secular model is off of that by a factor of 100,000. So once again, we should not be surprised when we see that real results from real science back up the history and the timeline of Scripture. And that's just a zoomed-in version of what you can see there. Evolution needs millions and billions of years. Radiometric dating is alleged to provide unequivocal proof that the Earth is 4.54 billion years old. However, as has been shown, radiometric ages are unreliable. In fact, radiometric dating provides evidence for a much younger Earth, in line with the history recorded in the Bible. And there's your summary right there. I'll kind of go through these one at a time, comment a little bit on them as you start writing them down. 3 things are required for radiometric dating methods to be accurate. The starting conditions are known, the decay rate is consistent, and no parent or daughter has been added to or subtracted from the system. That has to be true. Once again, there's no way to verify this. These assumptions can never be verified because you'd have to go back in time to do that, which none of us can do, unfortunately. And many samples of known age produce incorrect results, making the method unreliable. Again, whenever we see results come back from these radiometric dating tests of rocks that we actually know the ages of because we saw them being formed, they give us a scatter of inconsistent and inaccurate results. Carbon dating is demonstrably accurate back to about 4,000 years ago, no further. Again, you can't just say that carbon dating is accurate over all time because behind 4,000 years ago, on the back end of that, there aren't any written records to corroborate the numbers that you're getting. And the presence of carbon-14 in coal and helium and zircon crystals points to a very young Earth.